In the shadow of the Sierra Madre mountains, a quiet stranger in a weathered poncho sits alone at a canna's corner table, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, the notorious Guerra. Gang laughs at his solitary figure, unaware they're mocking the deadliest gunfighter in Mexico's history. They're about to discover that some legends don't seek glory, they wait patiently for trouble to find them. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Santa Rosa, a forgotten town nestled in the foothills of the Sierra Madre. The heat lingered like a heavy blanket, driving most inhabitants indoors to the relative comfort of adobe walls and terracotta floors. Only the occasional whisper of wind disturbed the silence, carrying with it the faint chime of spurs from a solid figure making his way toward Rose's Cantina. The stranger moved unhurriedly, each step measured and deliberate. His poncho, though clean, bore the marks of countless miles, its earth-toned fabric weathered by sun and wind. The wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his features had seen similar wear, but like its owner, it carried its age with quiet dignity. Those few townspeople brave enough to face the heat watched his passage with curious eyes, noting how he seemed to disturb neither dust nor air as he walked. Rose's Cantina had stood at the heart of Santa Rosa for 3 generations, its thick walls offering sanctuary from both the relentless sun and the troubles that occasionally swept through town like summer storms. Maria Rosales, named for her grandmother who'd founded the establishment, looked up from wiping glasses as the stranger entered. Something in the way he moved caught her attention, a fluid grace that seemed at odds with his weather-worn appearance. He chose a corner table, positioning himself with his back to the wall and a clear view of both the entrance and the side door that led to the stables. It was the kind of habit that spoke of years spent surviving, though his manner suggested patience rather than paranoia. When Maria approached to take his order, she noticed his hand steady and callous, with peculiar marks along the right index finger that she'd seen before on men intimate with gun leather. "Café pour or," he said softly, his voice carrying the gentle rasp of someone who spoke rarely but chose his words with cer. "And whatever soup you have." Today his Spanish was perfect, but carried an accent she couldn't quite place, as if he'd learned the language in multiple regions. The canna's afternoon quiet was shattered by the arrival of 6 riders, their horses' hooves thundering past the window before coming to a stop outside. The Goa gang had been making their presence felt in Santa Rosa for the past week, their reputation for casual cruelty preceding them like a dark cloud. Their leader, Eduardo Guerra, fancied himself a revolutionary, but his actions spoke more of personal profit than political ideology. As they entered the cantina, their spurs jingling discordantly against the wooden floor, the temperature in the room seemed to drop despite the heat. Regular patrons found reasons to study their drinks or quietly make their way to the exit. Maria's shoulders tensed as she moved behind the bar, her hand instinctively reaching for the scattered gun her father had hidden there years ago. Only the stranger in the corner remained seemingly unmoved by their entrance, his attention apparently focused on the steam rising from his coffee cup. This lack of reaction drew Gu's notice immediately, in a territory where his name inspired fear, or at least cautious respect. Indifference was an insult he couldn't ignore. "Hovio," Garrett called out, his voice carrying the false friendliness that often preceded violence. "You're sitting at my table." The stranger made no immediate response, taking a deliberate sip of his coffee before speaking. "I don't see your name on it, amigo." The words were soft but carried clearly in the tense silence. There was something in his tone, not challenge or bravado, but the simple statement of someone who had long ago moved beyond the need to prove anything. Maria recognized something else in that moment, a memory tickling at the edge of her consciousness. Years ago, her father had told her stories of a legendary gunfighter known as El Fantasma, the ghost. They said he moved like smoke, his guns appearing in his hands as if by magic, and that he'd never been known to draw first, but always drew last. The story said he wore a simple poncho and spoke softly, letting his actions carry his reputation. But those were just stories, tales told around cantina fires to frighten children and impress tourists, weren't they? Santa Rosa had not always been a town that attracted trouble. Nestled in the protective embrace of the Sierra Madre Mountains, it had once thrived as a waypoint for silver traders and merchants traveling between the coast and the interior. The cantina itself stood as a testament to more prosperous times, its hand-carved wooden beams and intricate work, speaking of an era when craft and beauty held more value than mere survival. Maria Rosel's knew every inch of the establishment, from the worn groove in the bar, where generations of patrons had rested their elbows, to the delicate painted flowers her grandmother had insisted on adding to the ceiling tiles. She'd grown up hearing the heartbeat of Santa Rosa in the murmur of conversations and the gentle clinking of glasses, learning to read its moods like a doctor monitoring a patient's pulse. These days, that pulse carried an undercurrent of fear. The Goa gang's arrival had changed something fundamental in the town's rhythm. Where once there had been the easy flow of commerce and community, now there was hesitation, a collective holding of breath. Shop owners closed earlier. Farmers hurried through their business in town, and mothers kept their children closer to home. Eduardo Guerra and his men had claimed Rosa's Cantina as their unofficial headquarters, driving away regular patrons with their loud voes and casual displays of menace. They treated the establishment like conquered territory, marking their dominance with overturned chairs and deliberately spilled drinks that Maria was expected to clean without complaint. The stranger in the poncho had arrived on the 7th day of their occupation. Maria watched him now as he sat unmoved by Gu's challenge, noting how the afternoon light caught the silver threads in his dark hair at the temples. There was something in his stillness that reminded her of the mountain lakes high in the Sierra Madre, peaceful on the surface but hiding unknowable depths. Perhaps, the stranger said, his voice carrying the same gentle tone as before. You'd care to join me instead of standing there making demands? He gestured to the empty chair across from him with a grace that somehow managed to make the invitation seem both courteous and subtly mocking. Gu's face darkened at the implied challenge. His right hand twitched near his gun belt, where an ornate revolver hung low in the fashionable style of men who cared more for appearance than practicality. You don't know who I am, old man. I know exactly who you are, Eduardo Guerra. The stranger reply carried a weight that stilled the movement in the room. Third son of Manuel Guerra, who lost his land to creditors and his honor to drink. You've spent 5 years trying to build a reputation worthy of your grandfather's name, but you're still just a boy playing at being bandito. The accuracy of this assessment hung in the air like smoke after gunfire. Gu's men exchanged uneasy glances, their usual bravado dampened by the stranger's intimate knowledge of their leader. Past Maria found herself holding her breath, her hand still resting on the scatter gun beneath the bar. And who are you, Goa? Demanded his voice, betraying a tremor of uncertainty. To speak of my family's history. The stranger took another unhurried sip of his coffee before responding, just a traveler who's heard stories, the same stories that speak of how you left your youngest brother to face federales alone in Monterrey while you rode to safety with his share of the gold. Gu's face went pale, then flushed with rage. This was a secret, he thought, buried with his brother in an unmarked grave. His hand moved closer to his gun, but something in the stranger continued stillness made him hesitate. It was at that moment that Don Francisco Ortega, the town's elderly physician, entered the cantina. He paused in the doorway, his weathered face registering first surprise, then a flash of recognition as his eyes fell on the stranger. The doctor had lived in Santa Rosa for over 4 decades, treating everything from mining accidents to gunshot wounds, and his memory was as sharp as his surgical instruments. Madre Dios, he whispered, though in the tense silence his words carried clearly El Fantasma. The name rippled through the room like a stone dropped in still water. Even Gu's men, hardened by years of violence, shifted uneasily. El Fantasma was more than just a legend. He was a ghost story told around campfires, a shadow that had haunted the borderlands for decades. They said he had been a soldier once, trained by both American and Mexican armies, before something happened that turned him into a wandering instrument of justice. The stranger showed no reaction to the name. But Maria noticed how his hands had disappeared beneath the poncho gaw too. Proud or too foolish to back down now, forced a laugh that sounded hollow even to his own ears. El Fantasma. That's just a story mothers use to frighten children, a myth all myths, the stranger replied. Softly have their roots in truth, young Guy. Your grandfather understood this. He was a man of honor despite his faults. He once told me that a true warrior knows when to fight and more importantly, when to walk away. The mention of his grandfather in the present tense, as if the stranger had known him personally, seemed to finally penetrate Gu's bravado. The implications of such knowledge, that this man was old enough to have known his grandfather, that the stories of El Fantasma decades of wandering might be true, caused him to take an unconscious step backward. Preparing and narrating the story took a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Young Miguel Rosales hadn't been born when El Fantasma name first became legend along the border. The 12-year-old boy, Maria's nephew, had spent the afternoon helping in the Cana's kitchen, stealing glances through the serving window at the tense scene unfolding in the main room. Like most children in the borderlands, he had grown up hearing stories of the mysterious gunfighter who appeared like morning mist and dispensed justice with supernatural accuracy. His grandfather, Don Xavier Rosales, had told him tales of El Fantasma exploits, how he had single-handedly prevented the massacre of an entire village near Chihuahua, disarming 20 bandits without taking a single life, how he could shoot a man's weapon from his hand at 50 paces in pitch darkness, how he had served in both the American and Mexican armies before choosing to answer to no flag but justice itself. Now watching the stranger in the poncho, Miguel noticed details that the adult seemed too focused on the tension to see. The way the man's poncho drape revealed no bulge of hidden weapons, yet Miguel was certain they were there. His boot spurs, unlike the jingling ones favored by Gu's men, were wrapped in leather strips to move in silence. Even the way he had positioned his chair, seemingly casual but allowing clear sight lines to every entrance and window, spoke of decades of survival instinct. Don Francisco, the physician, had moved carefully to the bar, his eyes never leaving the stranger. The doctor's hands, still steady despite his age, gripped his medical bag tightly. I was there, he whispered to Maria, though Miguel's young ears caught every word. 20 years ago, in Ciudad Juarez, I saw him take down the entire Morales cartel without killing a single man. They said it couldn't be done, that the only way to stop such men was through violence, but he did it with precision that seemed impossible, shooting guns from hands disabling without destroying, using skill instead of brutality. Maria listened intently while maintaining her professional demeanor, wiping glasses that were already clean. But Papa used to say El Fantasma would be an old man now if he's even still alive. Look at his eyes, Don Francisco replied softly. Those are the eyes of a man who has seen empires rise and fall, who has walked through the valleys of death and emerged carrying wisdom. Instead of vengeance, age hasn't weakened him, it has refined him. Gu's men had drawn closer to their leader, forming a loose semicircle that they likely thought appeared threatening, but actually exposed their poor tactical position. The stranger seemed to take no notice, but Miguel saw how his attention tracked every movement, how he remained aware of each man's position without appearing to look at them. Your father, the stranger said to Guerra, his voice carrying easily despite its softness, named you Eduardo after your grandfather's brother who died defending civilians during the revolution. He hoped the name would inspire you to live up to its legacy of protection rather than predation. What would he think of how you've used it? Gu's face twisted with a combination of rage and shock. You speak as if you knew them all. My grandfather, my uncle, my father. Impossible, you're just some old fool who's heard too many stories. The stranger agreed mildly, often carry more truth than histories written by the victors. Your grandfather taught me that, along with a particular technique for stopping a man's heart with a single shot at 30 paces. Would you like me to demonstrate the implicit threat delivered with the same gentle tone one might use to offer coffee? Sent a visible shiver through Gu's men. They had heard rumors of El Fantasma, legendary accuracy, how he could place a bullet exactly where he intended, whether to wound, disable, or end a life. Miguel watched in fascination as the stranger's right hand emerged from beneath the poncho, empty, but holding something more powerful than any weapon. Confidence born from absolute mastery. The movement was so smooth, so perfectly controlled that it seemed more like flowing water than human motion. I knew your grandfather in his final days, the stranger continued. Each word measured and deliberate. He spoke often of his regrets, of how the revolution had twisted noble causes into excuses for cruelty. His last wish was that his family would restore honor to the Guerra name. Instead, you've dragged it through the mud, using it to terrorize the very people your ancestors swore to protect. The truth of these words hung in the air like gum smoke, impossible to wave away. Even Gu's most hardened men shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that they stood in the presence of something beyond their experience, not just a legendary gunfighter, but a living piece of history who had walked with the giants of their past. The afternoon heat pressed against Rosa's cantina like a physical force, but inside the temperature seemed to drop with every word the stranger spoke. Through the window, the sun cast long shadows across the worn wooden floor, marking the passage of time in slow increments. As the tension continued to build outside, the usually busy street had grown quiet, as if the very town held its breath in anticipation of what would come next. Gu's second in command, that scarred man known only as El Coyote, moved his hand cautiously toward his weapon. The stranger's eyes flickered to him for just a moment, but that brief glance carried such weight that El Coyote froze mid-motion, his fingers trembling slightly before dropping away from his gun belt. Your men lack discipline, Eduardo, the stranger observed quietly. Another lesson your grandfather would have taught you had you known him. He understood that true strength lies not in how quickly you can draw a weapon, but in knowing when to keep it holstered. Don Francisco, still standing near the bar, cleared his throat softly. I remember when old Don Guerra ran this territory, he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of memories. There was justice then, even in lawless times. His men protected the people, helped the poor, maintained order without relying on fear. Gu's face flushed dark with anger and something else, shame perhaps, or the weight of expectations never met. The old ways died with the old men, he spat. This is a new world where strength makes right and the weak serve the strong. Is that what you truly believe? The stranger asked, and for the first time there was a note of sadness in his voice. Or is it simply easier than living up to the legacy you inherited? Maria watched the exchange while methodically drying glasses behind the bar, each movement precise and controlled despite her racing heart. You noticed how Miguel had edged closer to the kitchen door, positioning himself to run for help if needed. The boys' instincts were good, but she suspected that if violence erupted, it would be over before anyone could intervene. Gu's men had spread out further, unconsciously responding to their leader agitation. They numbered 6 in total, each one a hardened fighter, with notches on their guns and blood on their hands. Yet something about the stranger's continued calm made them move with unusual caution, like wolves circling a creature they couldn't quite identify as prey or predator. You speak of legacy, Gua said, his voice rising, of honor in the old ways. But where was honor when the government seized our lands? Where was justice when foreign companies bought our politicians and stole our resources? The old ways made us weak, made us bow and scrape before thieves in suits who called themselves businessmen. The stranger sat down his coffee cup with deliberate care. Your grandfather fought against those same injustices, Eduardo, but he understood the difference between resistance and revenge, between fighting for the people and terrorizing them. The methods you've chosen: extortion, intimidation, violence against the innocent. They don't fight the system, they become part of it or ran through the gathered men. Even El Coyote, known for his unquestioning loyalty, glanced at his leader with newly uncertain eyes. The stranger's words had struck at something fundamental, exposing the hollow core of their supposed revolution. You think you know so much about my family, Goa snarled, his composure cracking further, about honor and justice, yet you hide behind legends and stories. Who are you really, old man? A washed-up gunfighter living on borrowed reputation, or just a fool who's heard too many tales around campfires. The stranger's response was interrupted by the arrival of Padre Ignacio, the town's elderly priest. The clergyman paused in the doorway, his sharp eyes taking in the scene before him. Unlike the others, his reaction to the stranger showed no surprise, only a deep recognition. "I wondered if you would come," the priest said softly. "When I heard about the troubles here, I prayed you might find your way to Santa Rosa. You know this man, Padre Guerra?" demanded, his voice harsh with suspicion. "I know what he is, Padre," Ignacio replied calmly. "As to you, if you would only listen to what your heart tells you instead of your pride. I was there in the mountains near Durango, and he saved an entire village from men much like you have become. He did it without taking a single life, using skill instead of slaughter. They call him El Fantasma, not because he killed like a goat, but because he moved like one, appearing where justice was needed, then vanishing. Once it was done, the tension reaches a breaking point as past and present collide. Subscribe now to witness how this confrontation between justice and power unfolds. Tomorrow's video brings another tale of redemption that will leave you speechless. The late afternoon shadows had grown longer in Rosa's cantina, stretching across the floor like reaching fingers eoris through the windows. The setting sun painted the adobe walls in shades of blood and gold, a fitting backdrop to the tension that filled the room. The stranger remained seated, his posture relaxed but alert as Gu's men shifted uneasily in response to Padre Ignacio words. Durango, Gu's voice carried a hint of uncertainty. Now, that was 15 years ago. They said an entire gang of cattle rustlers was disarmed in seconds, their guns scattered in the dust before they could even aim. He studied the stranger with new eyes, as if trying to reconcile the legend with the quiet figure before him. 16 years, the stranger corrected softly. And it was 14 men, not an entire gang. Your uncle Ramon was there, Eduardo. He watched from the church tower, saw how it was possible to defeat evil without becoming evil. That's why he later chose to become a man of peace rather than follow your grandfather's path of violence. El Coyote, his scared face twisted in confusion, spoke for the first time. But those stories, they say El Fantasma learned his skills from both American gunfighters and Mexican revolutionaries, that he served in 2 armies and walked away from both when he saw how power corrupts. Stories grow with the telling. The stranger acknowledged, his hands still hidden beneath his poncho. But sometimes the truth is more remarkable than the legend. Your grandfather understood this, Eduardo. Why do you think he sent your Uncle Ramon to study with me after the Durango incident? The revelation hit Guerra like a physical blow. His face paled as memories of his uncle's teachings flooded back. Lessons about precision over power, about the responsibility that came with skill, about choosing one's battles wisely. You taught Teo. Ramon Maria, still behind the bar, remembered stories her father had told about Ramon Gara, how he had transformed from a fierce warrior into a respected mediator, how he had resolved conflicts without bloodshed until his death 5 years ago. The pieces were falling into place like a puzzle, revealing the larger picture. Don Francisco stepped forward, his medical bag clutched tightly. "I treated Ramon's wounds after Durango. He spoke of you not as El Fantasma, but as El Maestro. He said you showed him that the truest victory is the one where no blood is shed." The stranger's eyes, sharp despite his apparent age, moved to the doctor. "Ramon was a good student. He understood that the skills I taught weren't about domination but protection, about ending conflicts before they began." His gaze returned to Gua. "He would have taught you the same had you been willing to learn." Gu's men exchanged glances, their earlier bravado crumbling in the face of mounting evidence that they stood in the presence of a living legend. Even their leader seemed shaken, his hand no longer hovering near his gun, but hanging limply at his side. Young Miguel, still positioned near the kitchen door, watched in fascination as the stranger's words continued to dismantle the gang's confidence. He noticed how the man's poncho moved slightly, suggesting hidden movement beneath, not the nervous fidgeting of fear, but the precise adjustments of someone prepared for any possibility. "My Uncle Guerra said," his voice thick with conflicting emotions, "he spoke of you often in his final years. Said there was a man who could end a fight without firing a shot, who could disarm the deadliest gunman with a movement faster than thought. I thought they were just stories to entertain children sometimes, Padre Ignacio interjected gently. The stories we tell children carry the deepest truths. Your uncle understood this. He knew that true strength lies not in the ability to take life, but in the wisdom to preserve it. The stranger shifted slightly in his chair, and though the movement was minimal, it commanded the attention of everyone in the room. Your men are nervous, Eduardo, their hands itch for their weapons, but their hearts know better. Like you, they've heard the stories like you. They're beginning to wonder if perhaps the old ways weren't about weakness after all. El Coyote, his face showing an internal struggle, spoke again. They say you can shoot a man's gun from his hand without drawing blood, that you can stop a bullet in midair, that you move like smoke and strike like lightning. Legends, the stranger replied calmly. Lightning legends, the stranger replied calmly, often exaggerate, but they seldom emerge from nothing. His hands remained hidden, but there was a subtle change in his posture that made Guzman take an involuntary step backward. Would you like a demonstration? As legends and reality collide, stay tuned to witness a display of skill that will challenge everything these men believe about power and justice. Subscribe now. Tomorrow's video reveals another tale of redemption that will leave you speechless. The word demonstration hung in the air like gun smoke, heavy with promise and threat. The cantina had grown so quiet that the distant toll of the church bells seemed to echo through the room, marking the hour with solemn precision. Outside, the sun had dipped lower, casting long shadows through the windows that stretched across the worn floorboards like bars of a cage whose youngest man, brash youth called Haim, who had yet to learn the wisdom of patience, made the first move. Perhaps it was fear, or perhaps a desperate desire to prove himself, but his hand darted toward his gun with the quickness of youth. What happened next occurred so swiftly that even those watching closely had trouble following the sequence of events. There was no visible movement from the stranger, no dramatic flourish of his poncho, no obvious draw of a weapon. Yet somehow his gun suddenly hung suspended in the air between them, spinning slowly like a compass seeking north. The young man stared at his empty hand in disbelief, then at the hovering weapon before it gently descended to rest on the stranger's table. Your technique is flawed, the stranger said softly, as if he were instructing a student rather than disarming an opponent. You telegraph your intentions through your left shoulder. It's a tell your enemies can read like a newspaper headline. His hands remained hidden beneath his poncho, though several witnesses would later swear they never saw them emerge. Don Francisco leaned against the bar, his medical bag forgotten in his grip. In all his years of treating gunfight wounds, he had never seen anything like this, a disarming so smooth it appeared more like magic than combat. Maria crossed herself silently, while young Miguel's eyes grew wide with wonder. Impossible. El Coyote breathed, his hard face showing an emotion close to religious awe. No one can move that fast. Speed, the stranger replied, is less important than timing. Your grandfather understood this, Eduardo. He knew that the moment you choose to act is more crucial than the action itself. His eyes sharp beneath the brim of his hat fixed on Guerra. Would you like another demonstration? Gooseface worked through a complex series of emotions: fear, anger, doubt, and something that might have been recognition. My uncle, he said slowly, once told me about a technique that could disarm a man without touching his gun. I thought he was speaking in metaphors, teaching one of his philosophical lessons. Ramon always did love his metaphors. The stranger acknowledged a hint of fondness in his voice, but some lessons require more direct instruction. Your man Haim just learned one. Would you care to learn another? The remaining gang members had unconsciously drawn closer to their leader, seeking reassurance in proximity that their earlier bravado had evaporated like morning mist, replaced by an uncertainty that seemed to grow with each passing moment. Even G's customary arrogance had cracked, revealing glimpses of the boy he must have been when his uncle tried to teach him a better path. Padre Ignacio moved carefully through the tension, his presence a reminder of higher authorities than mere physical power. I remember watching you teach Ramon, he said to the stranger, how you showed him that true mastery lies not in domination, but in harmony, that the greatest victory is the one where no blood is Shed harmony, Gu's voice cracked. Slightly, what harmony can there be in a world that takes everything from you, that strips away your birthright, and leaves you with nothing but memories of former glory? The stranger's response carried a weight of understanding that made even the most hardened among Gu's men pause. Your grandfather asked me the same question once, Eduardo. Would you like to know his answer? Before Gu could respond, one of his men, a tall, thin enforcer known for his quick temper, made the mistake of trying to circle behind the stranger chair without appearing to move. Without even turning his head, the stranger spoke quietly. 3 more steps, and you'll lose more than just your weapon, amigo. The enforcer froze mid-step, suddenly aware that something cold and precise was pressed against the back of his neck. Though no one had seen the stranger draw or aim how he began, but his voice failed. Him whose spurs, the stranger explained calmly, make more noise than you think. 7 distinct sounds as you tried to flank me, each one telegraphing your position as clearly as a map. There was no mockery in his voice, only the patient tone of a teacher correcting a student mistake. Would you like to return to your companions, or shall we continue this lesson as the stranger's incredible skills begin to manifest? Subscribe to witness how this confrontation between old wisdom and young ambition unfolds. Tomorrow's video brings another tale of justice that will leave you breathless. The enforcer retreated to his companions with careful steps, his face pale beneath its weathered tan. The demonstration had shifted something fundamental in the Cana's atmosphere. Where before there had been tension born of uncertainty, now there was a growing awareness that they were in the presence of something beyond their experience. That stranger capabilities weren't just legend, they were reality, and that reality was far more unsettling than any story. Guerra watched his man's retreat with narrowed eyes, his mind visibly working through the implications of what he'd witnessed. His uncle Raman had often spoken of techniques that seemed to order on the supernatural, of abilities that transcended normal human limitations. At the time, young Eduardo had dismissed these tales as the exaggerations of an old man trying to teach moral lessons. Now faced with living proof, he found his worldview crumbling at its edges. You mentioned my grandfather's answer, Guerra said finally, his voice carrying less bravado than before, about finding harmony in a world that takes everything from you. The stranger nodded slightly, his hand still concealed beneath his poncho. He said that the world takes from everyone, Eduardo. The choice lies not in what we lose, but in what we do with what remains. Your grandfather lost his lands, his power, his position, but he never lost his honor. Do you know why? Maria, still behind the bar, found herself leaning forward slightly, as caught up in the moment as everyone else. She noticed how Miguel had edged closer to Don Francisco, the boy's natural curiosity overcoming his caution. Even El Coyote, usually so quick to violence, stood transfixed by the unfolding conversation, because the stranger continued into the expectant silence. He understood that true wealth lies not in what you possess, but in what you protect. The lands could be taken, the money could be stolen, but the respect he'd earned through justice and protection, that was his true legacy. A legacy you could have inherited had you chosen to understand, rather than simply react through the windows. Setting sun had painted the sky in deep purples and golds, creating an almost theatrical backdrop to the scene. The church bells tolled again, more distantly this time, as if the very elements were conspiring to underscore the gravity of the moment. My uncle Gua spoke, his voice carrying a hint of remembered affection. He tried to teach me things like this: about honor, about protection, about finding strength in service rather than dominance. I thought he'd grown soft, lost the fire that made our family great. And now, the stranger prompted gently. Now Guerra hesitated, glancing at his men, at the gun still lying untouched on the stranger table, at the enforcer who still couldn't quite explain what he felt at the back of his neck. Now I begin to wonder if perhaps I was the one who misunderstood what true strength means. The stranger's next movement, though slight, drew every eye in the room. He reached out with one hand, the first time it had emerged from beneath the poncho since the conversation began, and lifted his coffee cup. The hand was weathered, marked with the scars and calluses of countless battles, yet it moved with a grace that seemed almost impossible, each motion precise and controlled. Your uncle once asked me a similar question, the stranger said Setting the cup down with deliberate care, he wanted to know how someone could be both powerful and gentle, both deadly and merciful. Would you like to know what I told him before Guerra could respond? Canna's side door creaked open, admitting a gust of evening wind that stirred papers and rattled glasses. Two more of Gu's men entered, their expressions shifting quickly from routine to confusion as they registered the unusual tableau before them. One of them, reading the tension in the room, made the mistake of reaching for his weapon. What happened next would be debated in Santa Rosa for years to come. There was no visible movement from the stranger, no obvious cause and effect, yet somehow both newcomers found themselves abruptly disarmed, their guns hovering in the air. Before gently descending to join the first on the table, the entire sequence had taken less than a heartbeat, occurring so smoothly that several witnesses would later swear they must have imagined it. Your men continue to prove my point, Eduardo, the stranger observed mildly. They react without thinking, draw without purpose, threaten without understanding the consequences, just as you have been doing since you chose to forget your family's true legacy. The evening shadows had grown longer in Rosa's cantina, stretching across the floor like dark fingers reaching for truth. The collection of hovering guns on the stranger's table had become an impromptu monument to his inexplicable abilities, each weapon a testament to skills that seemed to transcend the natural order. The newly disarmed men stood with their companions, their expressions a mixture of awe and unease. Don Francisco moved closer to the bar, his medical bag clutched like a shield. In all his years of treating the aftermath of violence, he had never witnessed its prevention executed with such elegant precision. I was there, he said softly, his voice carrying in the hush room, when Ramon Guerra first began studying with El Fantasma. He said something I never forgot, that the greatest power lies not in the ability to take life, but in the wisdom to preserve it. Young Miguel, his eyes wide with wonder, had edged even closer to the unfolding drama. He noticed something that the adults focused on, the floating guns and dramatic confrontation, had missed. The stranger's poncho occasionally shifted in ways that didn't match the evening breeze, as if concealing movements too swift for the eye to follow. Gu's face had become a battlefield of emotions, pride wearing with uncertainty, anger with recognition, the weight of his family's legacy pressing against his chosen path. You speak of wisdom, he said to the stranger, his voice carrying less hostility than before, of honor and protection. But the world has changed, the old ways. The world always changes, the stranger interrupted gently, but principles remain constant. Your grandfather understood this. When the revolution came, he adapted his methods, but never his values. When foreign companies tried to buy his loyalty, he found new ways to protect his people. The world changed around him, but his core remained unshaken. El Coyote, his scared face thoughtful, spoke up unexpectedly. I knew men who rode with your grandfather, he said to Goa. They said he could face down an army with just his reputation, that his word alone was worth more than gold. They said. He hesitated, glancing at the stranger. They said he learned these things from a man who moved like smoke and struck like lightning. The stranger's hands emerged from beneath his poncho, moving with liquid grace to gather the confiscated weapons. Each gun he touched seemed to change somehow, as if his fingers were reading their histories, understanding their purposes. Your grandfather's favorite weapon, he said to Goa, was a cult peacemaker with silver inlays, not for vanity, but as a reminder that true power should shine in the light, not hide in shadows. Gu's hand moved unconsciously to his own gun.